A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. The first of which is if you have questions, feel free to type them into the question box on your admin toolbar over there. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Secondly, a recorded version of this will be emailed to you within the next 2 weeks as well for your reference. And then finally, everyone in attendance today will get 1 continuing education credit, which will also be emailed to you as well. So with that, I will turn it over to our ACSM moderator, Jeff Pottinger.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar sponsored by the American College of Sports Medicine and Polar USA titled Conditioning Your Athletes, Merging Cutting Edge with Common Sense. My name is Jeff Pottinger, and I'm a professor of movement science and the Dean of Graduate Education at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've been a member and fellow of ACSM for over 30 years. Today's webinar is full of great information and it is based on sound science and training application. I think you're in for a fantastic session. Our sponsors today have been instrumental in the promotion of cutting-edge training and conditioning of athletes for over 50 years. Polar has been leading the way in technological innovations and heart rate monitors since 1977. Headquartered in Lake Success, New York, Polar USA is a wholly owned subsidiary of Finland-based Polar Electro, which invented the first wireless heart rate monitor in 1977. Polar now operates internationally in more than 80 countries. The American College of Sports Medicine is the largest sports medicine and exercise science organization in the world. With more than 50,000 members and certified professionals worldwide, ACSM is dedicated to advancing and integrating scientific research to provide educational and practical applications of exercise science and sports medicine. Our speaker today is Jason Dirking, who is in his 10th year as Assistant Director of Sports Performance at the University of Louisville. In this role, he works directly with men's and women's swimming, men's soccer, cross country, and rowing. As the Energy Systems Specialist on the Sports Performance staff, Jason has played a key role in implementing the Polar Team 2 heart rate system, now employed by 11 of the Louisville athletic teams. He has advanced the use of innovative testing and tracking procedures for metabolic fitness, including VO2 max testing, blood lactate analysis, and GPS tracking. He has become an industry leader in the area of heart rate training and conditioning and has spoken at several regional and national clinics and conferences on the topic. Jason has worked with numerous athletes who have become professional soccer players as well as national champion runners and swimmers. Jason earned his master's degree in exercise physiology from Indiana University and a bachelor's degree in adult physical fitness from Eastern Kentucky University, where he also played baseball for the Colonials. Jason holds a number of certifications from professional organizations such as the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and he is also USA Weightlifting Level 1 coach. Jason is a competitive runner and triathlete and is a marathon finisher, a 2-time Ironman triathlon finisher, and an 8-time half Ironman finisher. During his second Ironman, he started a charity for spinal cord injury patients in Louisville, ultimately raising over $90,000 to pay housing and transportation costs for outpatients at the Fraser Rehabilitation Institute. It is with great pleasure that I present today's speaker, Jason Dirking.
Thank you, Dr. Pottinger, for that introduction, and I'm very excited to be a part of this webinar, and welcome to everybody that is listening in. This topic is something that is very near and dear to my heart, something that I've had personal experience with, just kind of getting into my post-collegiate career after baseball, shifting into a little bit more of the endurance sports, marathon training, and then shifting into triathlon and moving into Ironman. I've had a lot of personal experience with different conditioning plans and programming and kind of finding out what works and what doesn't, and then most importantly kind of how to apply that to our field sports and our court sports. And there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect with sports like swimming and distance running and rowing that are very physiologically based, and the knowledge and the programming that they utilize, and the testing and the technology side of it, and there's a disconnect with how that is applied to field sports and team sports. So what I try to do is connect those two and draw from the expertise and the knowledge of coaches that do that for a living, and then apply that a little bit more practically to other athletes. So this, I want to start by also thanking the ACSM and Polar for this opportunity. A lot of the information that is going to be presented today is kind of based around the Polar Team 2 system, but I don't want to get, although we're going to be talking about some of the numbers and what the software provides, I want to also make sure that this is practical and that there's a lot of takeaway, whether you have access to a heart rate monitor or a heart rate team system like Polar Team 2. I want to go more into what we've learned from the system and how that impacts our programming. So with that said, our overview today, we're going to touch first on the training philosophy and how we train energy systems from a philosophical standpoint. And then we'll get a little bit more in-depth on the actual heart rate side of it, and then how do we use heart rate and what have we learned from our years of collecting data to impact our planning, our periodization, how we look at a season for different sports, the concept of training load, volumes, intensities, recovery, all of that stuff that goes into planning an effective conditioning program. So starting with philosophy, one thing that I've noticed over the years is that the strength side of things, the programming from strength and power standpoint is pretty advanced. And largely, we know how to individualize programs. I put up a few of these examples here on the top line, kind of running the spectrum as far as the type of athletes that we deal with, from the far end Olympic weightlifter, strength and power athlete, to our NFL linebacker, to more of a running-based field sport professional soccer player, all the way to our Boston Marathon champion. And we look at these, and these are different sport athletes, but we see also, this kind of just symbolizes the differing body types and genetic makeups of our athletes, even within the same team, the same sport team. We take these athletes and these teams that come into the weight room, and obviously we don't always, or we don't hold them to the same expectations as far as how much weight they're going to squat or bench press. We understand different strength levels require different programming needs. Freshmen versus sophomores, juniors, upperclassmen that are more developed. And so we know how to individualize training. We know how to test appropriately using individual percentages of everybody's individual strength levels to program individualized in the weight room with our strength development. But then we take those same athletes on any given team, and when it comes to conditioning, we tend to line them up on the line and just blow the whistle and say, you've got 30 seconds to make it down and back. And if you don't make it, if one person misses, we all run it again. Not really taking into consideration the fact that 30 seconds may be a piece of cake for some athletes. It may be right on that borderline of what's possible for others, and then some athletes may not have a shot at running more than one rep in that goal time. So we understand that the necessity of individualizing strength programs, but then don't always go to the same length to individualize on that level for our conditioning programs. The second thing that I think we have an issue with is feeling like we with our conditioning programs, we need to always work to 100% relative intensity, regardless of the volume or the duration of the conditioning intervals or the conditioning session. If they don't look like this at the end of the session, it wasn't effective, or we didn't do our job as coaches, or we're not tough enough. And so is this picture always the goal of every conditioning session? Whether you're doing 100-yard repeats or 400s or mile repeats or a steady state, are we always expecting 100% relative intensity? And I think that's a problem in a lot of conditioning for field sports, is we don't, or we undervalue some of the lower end, lower intensity steady state work. So a couple points as it regards to our philosophy. The first and most important thing, kind of as I alluded to with our example of team sport athletes in the weight room, is the starting point needs to be appropriate testing. And so the goal of our testing needs to be very specific. I think a lot of times we're far too general in our testing, and the information that we get from our testing doesn't give us a lot of valuable information to actually individualize training programs and go beyond just putting a team in rank order from fittest to least fit. So the objective of testing is to identify specific physiological markers, both in terms of creating a physiological profile for an athlete and seeing really how are they made up, where are their strengths and weaknesses, and then secondly then to use those numbers and those values to actually individualize and program appropriate fitness training. So some of those numbers that we need to know, obviously, if you're going to be utilizing heart rate for your conditioning programming in any piece of that, we need to know certain heart rate values. The number one, probably most important, is the max heart rate for each individual. So doing an appropriate graded exercise test to get the most accurate estimate of each individual's maximum heart rate is our starting point. We know that those max heart rate values can vary up to 20 beats within athletes of the same age. So that 220 minus your age equation doesn't really work. I've found with our field sport athletes, we've had ranges from 194 max heart rate all the way up to 214 plus. So we know it's at least a 20 beat range. So if you don't have an accurate max heart rate, especially as it applies to the Team 2 system, because that's a big part of creating those training loads and analyzing the data, you're going to be off. A couple others would include that lactate threshold heart rate. Lactate threshold is also known as anaerobic threshold or maximum lactate steady state. A lot of interchangeable terms with that. But as far as the Polar Team 2 system goes, this may be close to or as important as that maximum heart rate value in terms of really gauging where intensities lie. And we know that there's a range there for that as well based on fitness level. Anywhere in the 80 to 88% or so percentage of maximum heart rate is where that lactate threshold heart rate is going to lie. So if you program based on beats per minute alone, or even as a given percentage of their maximum heart rate, especially when it's around that 80 to 85% range, and you're a couple percent over lactate threshold for some and under for others, you know that that intensity of that workout is going to be pretty different. So that heart rate is extremely important. Aerobic threshold heart rate, this one is less known and probably less utilized, harder to gauge an actual heart rate for this level, but we use a pretty accurate estimate, can be based off of right around 65% of maximum heart rate up to maybe 70%, but definitely below 70 We can also use a rating of perceived exertion of around 9 or 10 out of a 20 Borg scale RPE. Or breathing rate is really effective here, and this is as simple as it sounds, conversation pace. So when that heart rate and that breathing rate elevate, you're probably starting to tap more into anaerobic metabolism, starting to produce more lactate, and are above aerobic threshold heart rate. This number is really important for our base level aerobic training that we do early in the off season or for recovery work. So it's valuable and a valuable number to know. VO2 max is important to gauge a individual's aerobic capacity. Probably more important than that is that measure of aerobic power, which is our velocity at VO2 max. We know that VO2 max alone does not predict performance, but that individual velocity of where everybody, each individual is capable of performing at when they're at their VO2 max, and the length of time that they can sustain that velocity at VO2 max is much more important and predictive of performance. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also peak velocities, basically your 1RM. So similar to it in the weight room, getting a 1RM back squat or 1RM bench press to program percentages off of, you would get peak velocities in the same type of thing. So if running 100-yard sprints or 200s or 400s, half-mile repeats, mile repeats, if that's going to be a cornerstone of your conditioning program, it's probably valuable to actually do some 1RM testing after good warm-up to have them run those individual distances at their maximum effort. So you can program based off of percentages of those velocities for each individual. Secondly, we place a high importance, and by we I'm talking about obviously our program here at Louisville. We place a high importance on fully developing the aerobic system. And how we do that may differ a little bit from some people, but we understand the value of the aerobic system and how we need to develop it early on to provide the platform for all other adaptations at higher intensities. This chart here by Paul Gaston is a favorite of mine, looking at relative contribution of the anaerobic and aerobic energy systems and at different durations of maximal effort. So if you're looking at a 10-second maximal effort activity, we're already tapping 6% into that aerobic system. So if you look at something as anaerobic as we think something like a 400-meter sprint would fall for most athletes, depending on male, female, and what their ability levels are. A 400 probably range somewhere in that 60 to 75-second range. You're looking at close to 50-50 aerobic, anaerobic, where I think most people would tend to think that an all-out 400 is far more anaerobic than that. Probably back in the day, I would think it was closer to 90%. But this just shows probably the underestimated contribution of the aerobic system, even at maximal effort in very short durations. So this provides kind of a cornerstone of our philosophy. And then also understanding that in terms of maximizing total fitness, there are two different pathways to developing total fitness. And this has big implications when we're looking at long-term planning. For a fall sport, say what conditioning is going to look like in January and February when our ultimate objective is to peak somewhere in September and maintain that peak throughout an in-season that could last as long as December. So central adaptations and peripheral adaptations, understanding that there's basically two components of this equation, and the combination of both of those is what's going to ultimately result in what your total fitness ability is going to be. So understanding that adaptations to high-intensity training occur rapidly and saturate, or in other words, are maximized at fairly low volumes of training. So basically, it doesn't take a lot of volume at high intensities to achieve adaptation. The central adaptations are things more related to the delivery side. I look at central and peripheral kind of as delivery versus utilization. And that delivery side of things is going to be more the central circulatory performance, which are listed right there. So stroke volume, cardiac output, the strength of the heart muscle, all those things. They respond better to the high-intensity training, which makes sense. The things that jack up your heart rate the most are going to be the things that result in those adaptations. But the changes at the peripheral level, which would be skeletal muscle adaptations, such as mitochondrial volume or capillary density, aerobic enzymes, those take a lot longer to develop. So that also has implications with what type of work we do and when we do it, and in what volumes. So the conclusion would be, from the perspective of inducing adaptation, the combination of larger volumes of low-intensity training coupled with smaller volumes of high-intensity training might be the most effective combination for maximizing all those adaptations and resulting long-term in the best fitness. And I would also add the safest way to progress in minimizing injuries and maintaining a longer peak. This is one of my favorite slides. It comes from Mike Stone. He presented at the CSCCA conference a couple years back. And this is just a theoretical model of adaptation based on average relative intensity of training. So if you look at those different color coding, the gray would be a high average relative intensity, the blue is moderate, and the white is overall low relative intensity. So basically you have a combination of low and high intensity workouts in both of these, but when you look at the average of those relative intensities, we see the high, medium, low here. So 3 points to this as it relates to relative intensity of your training, and I think it applies across different types of training, but I'm going to focus more on obviously the conditioning side of things. That rate of gain is directly related to that average intensity. So what I kind of mentioned before is that your short-term adaptations respond better to high intensity, or high intensity work induces adaptations faster. So when you look at impacting, I've got to get somebody fit really fast in a preseason, for example, they come back unfit. What do? Well, to get the fastest rate of return, you do a lot of high-intensity work. That's going to provide you with your the faster adaptations. However, when you look at the height of your peak, basically how fit you can ultimately get, that is inversely correlated with your rate of gain. So the faster you gain, the faster you lose. The slower you gain, the higher the peak, and then also the length of the peak is inversely related to the rate of gain. So the more of that combination that I just talked about of doing more higher volumes of low intensity and then coupling it with smaller volumes of high intensity later will ultimately lead to a higher performance level, higher fitness level, and you'll be able to sustain that performance level for a longer period of time. For example, a soccer season or a basketball season. So we show this a lot to especially our fall sport athletes, because in the summer a lot of times is when they go home or we don't see them, so we're not in control of their training as much. And we try to impact their understanding of the importance of what that early summer work looks like, and obviously how it builds off of what we've started to do all the way back to January or February. We've got to put the pieces in place. We've got to spend the time early on so we can take our time a little bit more. We don't have to push that fast rate of intensity, but we have a longer period of time to train and ultimately are healthier and perform better at the end of that training cycle. So this just graphically would be a different representation of what I just showed, and this again is that example of a fall sport where the off-season starts in January, and of course in that spring semester at the collegiate level we're in control of that training. So if we're smart and we apply this training appropriately and we slowly build them over the course of the spring to a good fitness level, not necessarily thinking that we have to get them as fit as they need to be for the in-season. We leave them off in May at a good fitness level. We have two athletes here. The first one in green continues the training program and continues to progress systematically. And they come back in August for preseason fit. And we've got our athlete in red, who we all know who those are. We all have those athletes that decide that they would rather take it easy and have some time off and slowly lose fitness and come back in August unfit. So we do our performance testing, our fitness testing at the beginning of preseason. We have the good scores and the bad scores. And then they go through the preseason phase, a lot of two-a-day practices maybe, a lot of intensity. The person that's less fit is probably going to experience faster rate of gain, but that ultimate fitness level is not going to be as high. And then what we see a lot of, and a lot of this is based on our heart rate data, we show signs of fatigue or overtraining late in the season for those players that didn't come back as fit. Even though they might be able to gain that fitness over the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season and perform at a decent level, we see a lot of times they just cannot sustain that. And the stress that was placed on them in the course of the preseason, if we don't do it appropriately, catches up with them and manifests in fatigue and signs of overtraining toward the end of the season. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Then we try to perform the minimum amount of volume necessary. We're looking at what is the dose-response relationship, and this dose-response relationship is very common in the pharmaceutical world when you're looking at drug prescription. Basically describes the change in effect on an organism caused by differing levels of exposure to a stressor and after a certain time duration. So basically a small amount of the dose has no effect all the way to the far end. Too large of an amount is fatal. So I think this applies directly to our energy systems philosophy, in that the change in effect is just what our adaptation is to training. The organism is the athlete. The dose is that combination of volume and intensity, and what that training load is, and our stressor is training. So we know that not enough of an amount of training is not going to result in any adaptation, all the way to too much is going to be maybe not fatal, but certainly counterproductive. And the concept then of minimum effective dose is something that drives a lot of how we create our training system guidelines, and our model for whether it's aerobic threshold work or lactate threshold work or VO2 max work or lactate tolerance work or lactate production. We want to know what is the minimum volume necessary to induce the adaptation that we're looking for, because theoretically anything more than that is just not giving us any rate of return, and it's just adding to the stress and the recovery demands. So that's one thing that may be a little outside the scope of this webinar, but is certainly impactful in how we create our volume and intensity ranges for each training level. So you see that graph is as we increase training load, volumes, and intensities, there's going to be a positive response up to that optimal range, and then once we continue to do too much, it's going to start to manifest in negative feedback, negative responses. So the question I always get is, what is that optimal training load? And the simple answer is whatever that load is when the athletes are performing their best and recovering well. But that is a very oversimplified answer, obviously. That optimal training load is going to change depending on the time of the year, whereas early in the off-season, the optimal load may be lower, and during peak seasons of training late in the spring or late in the summer, as we get closer to in-season, or that optimal training load is going to be higher, also based on fitness level. So what a fit player can sustain, that optimal training load for that player is going to be higher than what an unfit player is going to be. And when we know that it changes over the course of a week or 2 weeks, what an athlete can sustain may result in fatigue 3-4 weeks down the road if you don't change up those loads. They might not be able to sustain the same training load for an extended period of time. All right, so getting a little bit more specifically into our polar heart rate data, basically what we're looking at is 3 main things. Number one, most importantly, is that training load number. And at its simplest level, the training load is simply volume times intensity. So volume being minutes played, and training intensity being a % of that maximum heart rate and the amount of time that they spend in those training zones, or at different % of their maximum heart rate. So there's a lot of other stuff that goes into that. When you create a player profile, you can add in height, weight, gender, obviously heart rate values such as maximum heart rate, threshold heart rate, resting heart rate reserve. All of these things impact the calculation of training load. And the training load calculation is an algorithm that we don't necessarily know. Polar knows it, and we can't change it. But the more accurate you can be in creating that player profile, the more accurate the training load calculation will be as well. So talking specifically about training load and recovery, this in my mind is one of the most valuable things, and one of the things that we've probably used the most to impact changes in our training philosophy and our planning and periodization of training. So looking at the training load on this example here, that black vertical line is a representation of training load from a session, this one being on August 28th. The training load value is about 245. And so as you'll see, as we talk about in a few minutes, fairly high training load. And based on fitness level, the Polar Team 2 system will predict a recovery time from that training session. So as you can see, there's 2 different components to this recovery curve. The first one, the sharper drop on the left side, is the metabolic component to recovery, so recovering glycogen stores, things like that. And then the second component is a predicted muscle recovery time. They term it muscle pain and inflammation. So that kind of that delayed onset muscle soreness component that will be probably more prevalent with the more higher end heart rate zone work that you do. The higher amount of time you spend up over threshold, it will predict a longer muscle recovery time. So this is what an example of a heart rate curve would look like. And this is an example taking a fit player and an unfit player. And this is a field sport athlete, 2 athletes that, based on a endurance level beep test, we have a fit player and we have a not fit player. And do the exact same training session for those 2 athletes, and we look at the heart rate responses, and you can clearly see the impact of fitness level for the exact same workload. The fitter player responds in blue with less of a heart rate response, lower heart rates, faster recoveries, and the less fit player is the heart rate curve in red and you can see for a given workload, much higher heart rate response. So on average, heart rate there, 73% versus 84. Calculated training load for this session for the fit player in blue, 128 versus 197. And it's important also to note, if you're unfamiliar with the polar training load concept, that these numbers, 128, 197, are just arbitrary units that is calculated, and this is just something that we've kind of grown to know what the numbers mean, but they don't necessarily reflect any specific value or unit. So now looking more importantly, I think, is looking at what the recovery demands for these two athletes are for that session. And you look at the player in blue who's fit, the predicted recovery time for that session is 12 hours. And the predicted recovery time for the less fit player, obviously a lot longer, 48 hours. So major implications for how to plan out a week for two very different levels of fitness with two different players. So what we used this information probably the most for was impacting how we approached our preseason phase of training, primarily for our field sports like soccer and lacrosse and field hockey. When we come back and we hit them with a lot of intensity, and typically 2-a-day practices for up to 2 weeks. Certainly football would fall in the same situation. This would be an example of a fit player's recovery curve, and you can tell based on the number of vertical black lines, that's 2-a-day sessions there for the first 4 days, and then 1 session there on the 20th and then day off on the 21st. And our fit player, for the most part, able to recover pretty fast. With the exception of those first couple sessions, you see pretty much full recovery there from session to session. So lower overall training loads, but then also very faster recovery. Same exact time frame now for an unfit player. And we look at those recovery curves, and you can see the dramatic difference there. So for the same exact training sessions, that unfit player responded with much higher training loads, but then the demands for recovery on those sessions is much greater. And so what we found for soccer, on average, our men's soccer game averages about 350 on the training load scale. So for a full 90-minute match, average training loads are around 350. So if we use that 350 number to indicate what a game is like, the total training load for those first 3 days for that player totaled 1,335. You divide that by a 350 training load for what an average game is, and it's almost the equivalent of playing 4 games in the first 3 days for that unfit player. Not only is that crazy to do, period, but the last person you would want to do that number, that volume and intensity with, is going to be an unfit player that's not equipped to handle that load. So this really impacted how we structured our preseason moving forward and how we started to handle fit versus unfit players. And now what happens when you get your group of unfit players who maybe don't pass a fitness test? What we used to do is breakfast club, and that would be like a 6 a.m. extra conditioning session. And whether it's within practice, after practice, or a breakfast club situation, for not passing a fitness test, fitness is the punishment, and we feel like more fitness is necessary for an unfit player. Well, what we see in that example, training sessions alone, lead to the highest daily training loads and the biggest needs for more recovery. So those unfit players, chronically under-recovered, highest daily training loads, obviously both of those mean increased risk of injury and overtraining. So how do we handle them? Very simply, extra high intensity conditioning is not the best answer for that. We do a lot of supplemental, what we call A1 work, which is our aerobic threshold. Good for recovery, but also can help start to build some of those aerobic adaptations without adding substantially to their recovery needs or their training loads that are already very high. If you're going to do extra high-intensity conditioning, it needs to be a substitute for practice minutes. So it needs to be kind of built in to those training load goals for a session. We know that they're not going to be able to do the same amount of work. And those are probably also the players that are going to be impacted negatively in terms of skill development. With higher levels of fatigue, poor technique is a concern. So at some point, the coach, and this probably happens visually, they need to make it a decision of whether or not that skill development is being negatively impacted. That would be a situation where pulling them off to the side, have them do straight ahead, some linear running, or on the bike for some non-impact, maybe a better use of their time. They can build the fitness without negatively impacting technique or skill. And then we also limit minutes during preseason and early season games. If we have players that come back and don't pass their fitness test, it's not that we hold them out, but we know that they can't be relied upon to provide effective minutes over a certain number. So we have kind of standards and guidelines as far as where they're at with their fitness tests and how many minutes they're going to be playing. So pretty simple here. Role of fitness. We know fitter players exhibit lower heart rates, lower training loads, and faster recovery for any given session or between sessions. And signs of fatigue are just the opposite: higher resting heart rates, higher heart rates for any given workload, and then slower recoveries within a practice, from drill to drill, from interval to interval, and slower recovery between practices and games. And then, of course, there's a lot of other signs of fatigue from a subjective standpoint, or things like weight loss or soreness, mood state, all those things that a wellness survey would be very valuable to do. And then identifying fatigue. This is something that's really kind of tricky without just kind of getting that subjective feedback from the athletes, trying to see if we can use the same training session at two different points of the year and see what the heart rate response is for the same player. So early season, this was an example of a player we were concerned about, and putting them through the same drills as an early season practice. Early season being in red, we see that in blue now. Later in the season, same training session, overall, a little bit higher heart rate for the given workload, and you see a little bit of the changes in the ability to recover from drill to drill. But doing that just as a practice is kind of challenging unless you know exactly the demands. So one thing that we started to do is what we call a modified beep test, or we use this a lot of times once every 2 weeks as a warm-up before a practice session. And the thing that I like about this is that it's very controlled and very repeatable. So I know exactly the work output that's being put upon these athletes is the same, exactly the same each time. So all I have to do is compare peak heart rates and recovery heart rates, and I can see whether they're responding with higher heart rates or not. And so this is just simply using the extended levels of the beep test, which comes at the end of the CD. For those of you familiar with the beep test, you can run certain levels for extended periods of time. We run level 6 for 3 minutes. We take 30 seconds recovery. We do level 8 for 2 minutes, 30 seconds recovery. Level 1 or level 10 for 1 minute, and then 30 seconds recovery. So I like it because it's differing. It's kind of a graded intensity. It takes them up around level 10, and I think there's a lot of different ways you could do this to kind of tap into a little bit different intensities, taking them roughly up to where their anaerobic threshold would be, but not a high amount of volume. And we simply look at what their peak heart rates are for each work interval there, and what their recovery heart rates are in that 30 seconds between those 3 different levels of intensity. And it's a good measure just saying whether they're exhibiting fatigue or not. And so to wrap up, just kind of looking at what are these appropriate training load ranges. And this was kind of key for us to kind of identify these numbers. As we gained more data, we felt more confident. We started to individualize a little bit team to team, and then ended up feeling like, training load is training load. There's obviously a number of different combinations of volumes and intensities that would end up with a given training load. So in other words, a lot of different ways to achieve a 200 training load. 30 minutes at very, very high intensity versus 3 hours at very low intensity. The result could both be the same training load at the end, but intensity and duration are very different. So, so we wanted to look at both training load, the training volume, and then training intensity, those three components, and develop a low, medium, and high range just as guidelines to understand what we were trying to shoot for. And we use training intensity as 90% of maximum heart rate as kind of our cutoff there. I think using a lactate threshold heart rate may be as effective or more effective to really truly individualize if you can get an accurate lactate threshold heart rate. If you can do the appropriate test and have a very confident number, we know 90% doesn't change. So, so we use these ranges here, as you can tell. Anything below 125 is a low load. Anything above 235 we color code as red, and that's high. Anything in between is moderate. These are daily ranges, so training volumes over 2 hours we consider as a high volume training session. And you have to be smart about this as far as saying, well, if they're just sitting around foam rolling or stretching at the beginning, it's probably don't really count that as volume, but work volume. Below an hour is low volume, above 2 hours is high volume. And then percent of total training time for any given session. If it's below 10% of the total training session is over 90% max heart rate, it's a low intensity session. Anything above 15% of the total training time over 90% heart rate is considered high intensity. So we can just extrapolate that to weekly ranges and look at anything somewhere. Our goal for the majority of sports, especially in season, is between 1,000 and 1,200 per week. And that's kind of just our standard, and it doesn't really matter what sport it is. I think if you're an Ironman triathlete, that's definitely an outlier and probably something where that load range might not be as appropriate. But for our field sports, basketball, things like that, it's a pretty good range. 6 to 12 hours worth of training a week. Obviously, we have a 1 day off minimum, and so those are the ranges as far as volumes that we shoot for, and the same overall percentage of time for the week over 90% max heart rate as a guide for our intensity ranges. Looking at an example of weekly periodization then, couple big picture things now. This obviously changes based on when your game schedule is, but looking at just a general week, this being a 6-day week with 1 day being off, this is an example where the day 6 there is a game. So generally, all things being equal, kind of following a low, medium, high structure. So we build to the highest load day and then scale back, take a recovery day or a low intensity day and build back up. Now, in terms of recovery, the first 5 days here were actually practices. We did practice, and then we did a 2-a-day there, 2 practices on Wednesday, Thursday low, Friday moderate, and then that 6th day with a large portion of red is a game. So you can see, especially in this example, day 3 versus day 6. Day 3 being a higher load day, but you can see the percentage of time in that 90% range, which is color-coded red, 90% to 100% max heart rate is a lot lower. So that 6th day, lower load, higher relative intensity If you look at the recovery demands from that, you can see that 2 sessions on Wednesday, the combination of that wasn't as intense, or what the combination of that didn't lead to as much recovery time because the overall intensity was fairly low. Whereas even though the overall load of that one game was lower, the percentage of intensity, time over 90%, in that red zone was a lot higher, a lot greater recovery demands. So it's important to look at intensity and not just load. And this is a different way of looking at that, kind of that low, medium, high structure, following that flow. And again, there's a lot of different ways that a week can be structured based on when games are. But that's kind of our general format. Games look a lot different for different sports. This is just kind of an accumulation of our data for different sports. There's a wide range based on any given game has a lot of different dynamics to it. But we know that, obviously, in our example of soccer or lacrosse, those games that are higher training loads, up around 300, 350, are going to require a lot more recovery. So over the course of a week, if you have 2 games, that's a lot. And those other days may have to be low-intensity days or low training load days if you're playing 2 games a week. Whereas maybe field hockey or basketball, the overall load from a game might not be as high. You're probably going to see some weeks where you're playing 3 games a week, and your practice loads may be able to be a little bit higher because you know the game loads are not as high. So just some basic recommendations. We use the 1,000 to 1,200 training load as a starting point. That's essentially our budget for the week. When we're creating a training plan for in-season, we lay out the calendar. We plug in when our games are. We plug in when our off days are. Then we know we have what other days we have to work with. Ideally, we're trying not to get more than 2 red days per week. We always try to follow our red days, our highest load days, with our lowest load days. Or we try to alternate high and low training load days. And then lastly, our practice planning. The great thing about Polar is we can phase out a training session and really individually analyze each piece of it. So we create essentially a training menu and know that certain drills elicit higher or lower intensities. And basically our small-sided game structure, if the dimensions are the same of the grid that you're playing in, you add more players, each player has less involvement with the ball, it's an overall lower intensity drill. If you have the same amount of players and you want to make it higher intensity, you increase the size of the grid. If you want to make it lower intensity with the same amount of players, you shorten the space that they play in and less overall work, lower intensity. So there's a lot of ways we can manipulate our practice structure to gain higher or lower intensities. I know that was a lot of information, and I tried to keep it to under an hour, so I would be more than happy to answer any questions at this time, and my contact information is listed as well, so feel free to contact me with any further questions. Jeff, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Jason. That was outstanding. A lot of great information that I think is useful to a wide variety of people. So I appreciate you personally taking the time to share with us your knowledge on these important concepts as it relates to training different types of athletes. We do have a couple of questions that have been submitted that I would like to get started on as other individuals think of questions and send them in. We probably have a couple of minutes remaining in our webinar today, but let me go ahead and get started. Jason, early in the webinar, you indicated that you often see coaches put groups of athletes on the starting line and then run them through a training session where everybody's doing the same, and we know those athletes are different. So can you comment on the importance, or maybe talk a little bit about how important it is to create individualized training programs for your athletes, recognizing that it is more work but it's certainly something that you need to do.
Yeah, and I think you look at just the example of strength training programs that I alluded to in the beginning, and you know you're not going to throw 250 pounds on the bar and make everybody bench press it. So it really comes down to appropriate testing at the beginning and identifying the fit versus the unfit, whether you utilize heart rates or individual velocities, like I mentioned, those 1RMs. If you're going to be doing 100s or 200s or 400s, whatever distances are kind of your go-tos for your conditioning workouts, try to get an idea of what everybody's best rep is so you can at least, if not individualize to the person, be able to group them up. And we use a lot of times, we go in groups of 3 or 4, whether we hold them to a specific goal time or are running 30-30s and have them covering different distances. They're at least working with a group that's of similar fitness level, and then if somebody's performing extremely well after that workout, we can make an adjustment for the next one. But the importance of individualizing or trying to create an individualized plan is extremely important, especially with fitness levels, because you can overtrain somebody really quickly, I believe, and train them totally differently as well. If it's too easy for one athlete and way too hard for another, you're training totally different qualities, and so you're not achieving the same objective. So to do appropriate testing in the beginning to identify strengths and weaknesses is the key.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Something that's a follow-up to that, one of the attendees today wants to know how many people collaborate to determine a team's training program. It seems like a daunting task for one coach. And I'll give you a moment to think about that answer, but I think it's important to identify individualized training. So if you go ahead and give us an answer to that. So when you work with your teams at Louisville, how many people are involved in the process?
The sports performance coach is kind of tasked with the program design. The sport coaches are integral into that, though, because ultimately it's a balance of training loads from training sessions, what the practices look like, and then what supplemental conditioning is going to be done outside of that. And so to plan out a semester in advance is really important, and that's kind of where that concept of layout, whether it's your off season or your in season, just in terms of like a calendar, and just plug in exactly when, say, Saturday and Sunday is always going to be off days, then you're looking at Monday through Friday. And just even as simple as just green, yellow, red, whether it's quantified or not in terms of heart rate or whatever, just knowing that the objective in terms of the minutes of the session and what your goal in terms of overall intensity is going to be. Even if you're not quantifying that, just having an understanding of that. But working together with the sport coaches and sports performance is critical so that we have the best understanding of what the overall loads we're placing on these athletes. Because as a sports performance coach, it's easy for me to only look at the conditioning workouts that I'm doing or the strength workouts that I'm doing and not consider the load that's being put on these athletes at practice, and not considering that is going to overtrain them in a hurry. So having a sit-down meeting is really important at the beginning, and just understanding, okay, here are the tests we're going to do. This is the information after the testing is done. Here's the understanding of where everybody is on the team in terms of the fitness level. These are the ones we can push. These are the ones we need to watch. And then being on the same page as far as what the training session looks like from a practice standpoint, and then what supplemental conditioning needs to be done after that. that's as general as I could probably get without talking too specifically to that. Yeah, just being able to kind of look big picture at the beginning and having an understanding of what the week is going to look like in the flow is the starting point.
Great. Thank you, Jason. One final question. This is sort of a physiology/training adaptation question. If an athlete has predominantly type 2A and 2B fibers, in other words, fast twitch fibers, in general, how long does it take that athlete to sort of get a conversion or change the fibers to be predominantly type 1 fibers? In other words, have those type 2 fibers look more or respond more like type 1 fibers. So if you can give us some general thoughts on that, that'd be great.
That's a tough one to answer. I don't know how much conversion you can actually get. It really depends on the training age of the athlete and the amount of training that you're able to do. I think after about a minimum of 6 weeks or so, you may start to get a little bit of a shift. When we're looking at our aerobic adaptations, such as around aerobic threshold, the peripheral adaptations take 4 to 6 months to really start to develop. So larger volumes of low intensity, it's going to take longer time versus your higher intensity work can take 4 to 6 weeks to hit some peak adaptations of those qualities. So I guess my simple answer would be somewhere in the 4 to 6 month range would probably be the answer, and that's where a lot of times coaches don't have the patience to really put in the work to develop those qualities long term. But we try to look at our athletes as a 4-year plan and not necessarily a 6-week, although it's challenging because we have needs of short-term gains. We have seasons to go through, and we need to get them fit or peaked for certain events. But when we have a player coming back unfit, it is what it is. You can either train slow and progressively and be healthier maybe, but not hit the adaptations you need in time, versus the trade-off of hitting high intensities early and getting a better rate of return, but maybe putting the athlete at higher risk. So,
okay, great. Thank you. We have time for one last question. How do you calculate an appropriate work-rest ratio for trained and untrained athletes? In other words, fit and unfit athletes. What are some general principles that you might use for calculating that work-rest ratio during a training session?
Well, the less fit, I mean, probably the general answer when you're talking in terms of like the CSCCA guidelines, the longer the rest period is going to be more appropriate for unfit athletes. So if you're coming back unfit, we need more of that 1 to 4 work to rest. But that's a very kind of a misleading. I don't like to deal in those terms because it all depends on the intensity of the interval and the total duration and total volume of work that you plan on doing for a session. So the work to rest is not the only thing that you have to consider. What I would do even more so than that is just working to try to understand, again, going back to the appropriate testing, is to work everybody within the same relative intensity. And saying, okay, I feel confident in saying we're going to do a 1 to 3, for example, work to rest for a more anaerobic workout, but everybody is going to be working in that work period at the same relative intensity. So your goal time might be different than my goal time if I'm fitter than you. And the work to rest should balance out for each individual. Because that less fit player is not being held to the same intensity, absolute intensity, as the fitter player. So if you and I are working at the same relative intensity, that rest period should be equivalent for each of us. In general, if you're less fit, you need more recovery. And the higher amount of volume you're doing within a workout, you should overall lower your average intensity if you're doing a high volume workout, and lower rest periods. If you're going to do high intensity work, you need longer rest periods. So up to the highest anaerobic work you can do needs to have full recovery, 1-to-10 ratio to 1-to-15. As opposed to like your aerobic work is going to be more 1-to-1 work to rest, or even less than that.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I want to thank everyone that's participated as an attendee in today's webinar. I want to personally thank Jason for his work today in preparation and his delivery of the webinar. And I want to also thank our sponsors, the American College of Sports Medicine and Polar USA, for supporting Jason in his efforts today. This concludes the webinar. We hope you will look forward to more webinars from ACSM in the future. Thank you very much, and everybody have a great day.